Hello, everybody. My name is Francis Conrad, and I help people to live the life that they love. Today, I'm I'm looking forward to exploring this topic with you because I think that I've come to appreciate story more and more over the years. And tonight, I'm going to share three different ways that I think story can benefit us and can really make a major difference in our life. So let's start by looking at what is a story, what makes it up. And most stories follow the exact same simple pattern. They begin with something that grabs your attention, and you know, oh, this is going to have to somehow resolve itself. I watched a movie last night, and within the first part of the movie, these two boys who were picked up by juvenile detention and had major problems in their history were dropped off to spend time with this family. They had no place else to place them. So you know what the theme's going to be right away. It's going to be, here's two kids that have a major history of violence and problems. Of course, they're going to have to deal with this in this family. And what's going to happen out of all that, we won't know until we see the movie, until we read or hear the story. So stories start somewhere, and they hook us onto a theme, and then that theme, generally, with most good stories, that theme will have challenges. There's going to be things that are going to be difficult, things that are going to be real problems to overcome and face. So the story not only gets us started looking at the theme, but then we go out and search. How is this going to evolve? How are we going to manage the issues that come up? And then the greatest part of all stories is what I call the breakthrough. At the end of the challenges and all the frustrations or whatever else might be going on, this is when something major busts through, it breaks through, and the story resolves and characters are transformed. In the story with the kids that I watched the other night, by the end of the movie, they were totally different, and they fit in to this family because they really felt accepted and loved, and they had built a community with each other, things that were totally absent in the beginning. So what was the story about? It was about this struggle that this family had integrating and bringing these troubled kids into their home and helping them to totally transform and change their lives. I thought it was a great movie because it had all the essential parts. You know, it started off with a major challenge, and in this movie, the story really brings us in touch with how difficult these lives were for these kids before they moved in with the family, and then how that spilled over, that they still had a lot of problems to deal with and to see differently. And that was going to be the challenge of the family. So first of all, I would say this movie rates really high, or I could say the story rates really high because it was coherent. What was going on with the family and with the kids, it seemed so real to me. What was going on felt real. It was like when they were struggling, when they were having difficulties, you were right in the pits with them, and you were struggling along and seeing what can happen in these types of situations. It was coherent. Besides going coherent, though, it felt like it was a real possible movie because it fit together from the beginning to the breakthrough. Everything that happened gradually led us to what the breakthrough was going to be about. And so it fit together, it was coherent, and mostly what I would say is that as a result of this story, the lives of the two parents that took these kids in and the lives of the kids who were in trouble, they all gained a level of meaning and purpose as a result of what happened in their time together. Now, I want to talk some more about story, and I want to start with looking at the word itself. Story's been around for a long time. We know that it goes back to about the 13th century, and at that time it comes from a Latin word, and the Latin word was historia, and that's really our word today for history. And so what was a story originally, but it was seen as a history. It was meant to be an accurate rendition of something that happened historically. And when they gave that rendition, that was called history, but it was also called a story. Stories have obviously changed a lot. When you think of what has happened to story, it's almost like as if it got turned over on its head. Because look at today, we have stories which are fantasy. There's like no history at all. We have stories that create realities that are totally unheard of. Nobody's ever experienced them. And we have stories that take us into places that we've never ourselves had to deal with, and the story becomes a possible future. So all these different things are so upside down and backwards from the way story initially was meant to be used. We're no longer dealing with an accurate representation of the past, but we're more dealing with a future and dealing with realities that maybe never even existed. So our stories have come a long way, and I think that there's some real advantage to that. So let's look at story from three different places. And the first one is very common because I think all of us have a certain amount of story that we develop around our own life. So we could call this our personal story. Somebody's personal story usually is anchored in some experiences or something that represents the beginning of our story in childhood. And then the struggles since that beginning evolve over time. And at some point, way beyond the childhood or past experience, at some point that might resolve and break through into a whole new way of looking at that, a whole new experience that along the way was not at all a part of the story. So you end up with children who are maybe severely abused or having major problems when they're young and getting into all types of trouble. And that's their way of evolving their story. Not only did it start with them having problems, but then those problems amplified in school, maybe took them into drugs or alcohol or problems with the law. And as these problems and all this stuff move into a third part of the story, maybe the breakthrough comes by meeting somebody or by falling in love with a girlfriend who helps them to look at their whole story differently. And all of a sudden, we have the breakthrough. All of a sudden, all of what's happened to them has brought them to this point, to a place where it now makes sense that with all their struggles, it was always leading them to become this leader or leading them to see life from a totally different perspective. And because of their understanding of what they've been through, maybe they help other kids to go through, evolving their stories in a similar way. So a personal story goes back into my own personal history. It's a history story. And it evolves with all the different challenges related to that history. But then by the time the breakthrough comes, we're not sure that this story is going to basically transform the person. We're not sure what's going to happen. That's the excitement that comes up at the point of breakthrough. Is our hero going to make it? Is he going to get through this? Is his girlfriend going to really be able to help him to get out of this way of thinking and seeing? And when that happens, boy, it's a celebration. It's like, wow, he made it. And the story has the kind of ending that really feels coherent, like, wow, that made a lot of sense. So I'm going to call that the personal story. And what we end up with from our personal story is that gives meaning to my life. It gives purpose to my life. I'm able, as a result of the way I tell my story, I'm able to really give a foundation and a grounding to what life really means for me, to what my purpose in life is. I'd like to talk about a second type of story besides the personal story. And I'll start that with a guy that I met years ago when I was traveling in Sumatra in Indonesia. On the island, there was a volcano, and a huge, the largest island that was in the center of where the old volcano was, surrounded by water. And it was on this island at a town called Tuk Tuk. And I met this boy who was around 20 years old. And when he found me, he and I spent quite a bit of time talking. In fact, he came back and we met every single day for about 4 or 5 days after the story begins. So what was it that got us to connect up with each other and to spend all this time together? Well, he told me that he grew up in Holland. And in the town that he grew up in, he was considered the bad kid, and no parent would allow their children to spend time with him because they knew he's a bad kid. If my kids hang out with him, they're going to get in trouble. So by the time he was 18 years old, he knew that he couldn't really be himself in this town. He had such a bad reputation, and all he wanted to do is get out of town and go as far as he could. So at 18, he left, and he traveled to India. He spent quite a bit of time in India going around different places. And eventually, part of that journey led to the island of Sumatra and to Tuk Tuk, where I was. And so he shows up and tells me this story. And as he was talking, it wasn't coherent. It didn't fit. I looked at him and I'm thinking, you've been traveling for the last almost 2 years. And when I talk to you and I see you, you don't look like that kid that you're describing who is nothing but a troublemaker. You've grown so much. Who you are no longer fits your idea of who you think you are. And so we talked, and what came out is that in this village, small town really, of Tuk Tuk, there was a girl that he really liked. But he felt, I can't ask her out. I can't really open myself up to her because I have this reputation. I'm this bad person. Anybody I meet really should stay away from me because they're going to end up in trouble. And I looked at him going, you got to be kidding. That doesn't fit you at all. Look at how much you've changed. He didn't realize it. He had changed dramatically, but he was still living the old story. And the old story didn't fit. And that's why we met for the next, I think, 4 or 5 days. Every day we met and talked. And I helped him to see and reflect back to him a new story. And the new story talked about how when he left Holland, his whole life gradually began to change, and how he has transformed into a different type of person. And now, on the last day that we met, he came up and told me how excited he was because he felt so good about being able to go up and talk to this girl that he liked and that they were going to spend some time together. That's what I think story at its best can do. He took a story that looked like it was heading for disaster, a story that wasn't even real, it didn't even fit. And together we were able to rewrite the story. And as a result of rewriting the story, his life was no longer the same. That to me is just an amazing power that we have in story. So we said originally, story is history. It's looking back in time. It starts somewhere and moves to the present. A lot of personal stories start in childhood and move through adolescence and young adulthood. And as that story moves and evolves, it's a history story. It's got its roots in the person's past and evolves with their personal history. The second type of story with the boy from Tuk Tuk, that story is not based on his past as much as it's based on the future. It's based on him changing his story so that who he's becoming now is not the same person that came out of that past. So I say stories can look to the past, and it has value because by looking at the past, the story has the ability to bring meaning and purpose into a life. But to look into the future, the story has the power to change, absolutely change, who I become. It's no longer that I'm the same person because I've changed my story. I am now looking at life through different eyes in a different way. So I want to talk about the third way, besides personal story and besides a story where you transform your future. Now the third way, it's called a brand story, and we use this in business. I in my business, take people overseas, and as we travel, I really teach them how to travel in a way that transforms their life. So the brand story starts with my own experience, in my history. The first time I traveled, how my life was totally transformed and changed as a result of travel and meeting this man in Turkey. So my story is similar to the boy from Tuk Tuk. Somebody came along, and as a result, my story changed. Well, how did it change? Before I met him, I was terrified. I was shut down. I was really withdrawn, and I did not feel like I was acceptable. And after I met that man, for whatever reason, I knew, and it's never left me, I knew that there was something larger, a reality that was bigger than I could see. And this reality helped me to change my story. I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew I was being watched over. I even felt like I would always be protected. And those things have never left me. I've traveled my whole life, and I've always been protected. I've always been part of something larger, and I've always felt like I was guided. That is how my brand story starts, because what I do in my business and how people are transformed is I introduce them to not only travel in the life on the road, but traveling in such a way that they become more and more aware of this larger reality that we all share. So my brand story is how travelers, as a result of coming with our experience, how their lives are transformed by being a part of something larger, by being guided. And then as a result of that, they take that story back home, and they have a lot of support to be able to integrate that new sense of being part of something larger, and how that gives their life a new place, a new sense of meaning and purpose. And they integrate that so that they don't go back to the old story, but they live their life continuing with the values that they gained from being a part of this group, but mostly from experiencing what it's like to be guided, what it's like to be part of this larger reality. So I'm going to leave you with a question. And the question is, if you think of your own life, not only your history, but also where you're going, what it is that defines your story, what I'd like you to think about, this is the question. Where is your story, your contemporary story, leading you? Where are you going? And is your story really adequate to represent what's very best about you? Is it adequate to really bring sense and meaning and purpose to all the experiences you've had in your life? So just sit with that and allow yourself to really ponder over your own story, and that your life really is a story that's evolving, and that you have, if it's not the life you want, you have the opportunity to take that story and to change it. What would that look like? Thank you for letting me talk about story today. I think that, we are all story makers. We're all here to tell stories, to share stories, and in many ways, because of our own stories, to introduce others to some of the most powerful, meaningful experiences of our life. So thank you, and I'm hoping that all of you get to live the life that you love.